In this section, we'll look how the New Left began to mature as the 1960s went on and began to broaden into a anti-establishment sort of cultural phenomenon. This so-called counterculture questioned traditional assumptions about materialism and competitive capitalism, sexuality, and modes of authority. It valued new ideas and creativity. It valued collectivism and sharing, environmentalism. It favored experimentation in all of its forms. It endorsed things like yoga and broader spiritual consciousness, including Eastern religions. It stressed it didn't matter what other people thought. New ways of thinking could lead to true happiness and peace, it argued. In time, the counterculture would become known largely as the hippies, obviously growing from the 1950s bohemian hipster culture. It came to embrace sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Well, sex, drugs, and rock and roll will all be discussed in a little more detail in other sections of this lecture, but in this section it's important to tie them in as a central concept of the counterculture in general. First, of course, the New Left's counterculture was youth-based, obviously growing from the maturation of the baby boom. Don't trust anybody over 30, was their saying. The establishment was often derisively called Big Brother or simply the man. There's a common phrase, make love, not war, although there's a dispute over how that phrase was originated. The counterculture hippies rejected traditional styles. Men wore their hair long, and sideburns and beards and mustaches were popular. Bandanas were often worn to keep their hair in place. Women often went braless and wore short skirts or contrast long flowing dresses. Hairstyles were generally long and bangs were common. Fluffy hats were common. And sometimes women wore flowers in the hair, which gave birth to the phrase flower children. You'll see it was important to reject commercialism, so hippies would not wear clothes that are mass marketed to produce. You're more likely to have jeans and off-rack brown, bright-colored shirts and beads. And in time, tie-dyed shirts were popular. Sandals were popular, although often bare feet was all they really needed. If you're an African American, this was the age of the afro. If the counterculture had a capital, it would probably have been the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco, named for the intersection of those two streets. Beatniks had begun congregating in the neighborhood in the 1950s, which had kind of fallen by that point into a bit of disrepair. The neighborhood offered a concentrated gathering spot for hippies to sort of create a social experiment that would spread around the nation. The opening of the psychedelic shop, as they called it, really it was one of the nation's first head shops in 1966, sort of offered hippies a place to buy what they needed to smoke their pot and to congregate. The Haight-Ashbury district eventually had things like free medical clinics and support groups for the hippies that congregated there. Another presence in the Haight-Ashbury district were the Diggers, which they called themselves a local community anarchist group, but they were known for street theater, and all of this sort of made Haight-Ashbury internationally famous and a destination for young people around the country. Often considered a peak of the counterculture was San Francisco's 1967 Summer of Love, which brought almost 100,000 young people to San Francisco. In January of that year, a celebration and fair known as the Human Be-In at the Golden Gate Park was planned, organized by the artist Michael Bowen. It was advertised in the Haight-Ashbury hippie newspaper, the San Francisco Oracle. When the Be-In drew over 30,000 hippies, the influx of people just kept coming throughout the spring and into the early summer, and a number of Haight-Ashbury hippie and community groups began organizing the Council for the Summer of Love to try to assist with, providing food and sanitation and music and crafts and everything to welcome and take care of the masses as they came into San Francisco. Yeah, they got a lot of volunteers, by the way, from local churches and social groups. In the end, the Summer of Love really received tremendous national coverage and just encouraged more young people to come. By the 1960s, the New Left was clearly a fractious movement. Some were bordering on political revolution, while others were completely withdrawn from society. The former included the Yippies, or the Youth International Party, an obvious takeoff from the Hippies. It even adopted a black flag with a red star and a marijuana lamp, sort of a marijuana plant rather, overlaid on it. The Yippies would have scheduled protests and often have political theater to help draw attention. Founding the Yippies were the well-known activists Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, among several others, including Paul Krasner, who reportedly coined the phrase Yippies. The Yippies held their first press conference in March 1968, 5 months before the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. There they sort of promised disruption in political theater, even joking that they would put LSD in Chicago's water system. They promised to nominate a pig that they named Pegasus, which is a play on the Greek mythology Pegasus, the winged pig. They at the convention itself, the Yippies were among a wide array of protesters, which unfortunately became violent, and this led to the arrest of a number of people, including Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, and they became known as the Chicago Seven. We'll discuss the 1968 Democratic Convention in a different section of this lecture, but I should note here that the government charged 7 of the protest leaders with the charge of conspiracy to incite riots, and this included the Yippie leaders Hoffman and Rubin. They became known as the Chicago Seven. Ultimately, 5 were convicted, but all eventually were overthrown. The trial helped make Rubin and Hoffman internationally famous. I should note that the Yippie movement continued well into the new millennium, although Hoffman committed suicide in 1989, having been diagnosed with bipolar disease. Rubin was quite a different story. He didn't stay a radical, but rather did a 180-degree turn, becoming a businessman who, by the way, made multi-millions investing in Apple, among other businesses. And before Hoffman's death, Rubin would debate him in what they called Yippie versus Yuppie. While some in the youthful New Left counterculture remained active politically, like the Yippies, others sought to withdraw altogether. And this led to a revival of an American communal movement. Communes, of course, they weren't new to American history. They go back to the early 1800s. Indeed, the 1960s communes were incredibly varied, and with varying degrees of organization and success. Some were religious, others weren't. Some required work, others didn't. In general, they all sort of shared the countercultural ideals. They all sort of revolved in one way or another around sex, drugs, and rock and roll culture. Those will be discussed in more detail in other sections of this lecture. But this concludes the section on the New Left as it matures into a counterculture.